Good morning, everybody. We have another week of SEC football to talk about because we had more than just an SEC championship game this last weekend. We'll touch on that later. But we're in the thick of one of the most intriguing coaching searches we've seen in a while in the SEC. It's complicated. It seems like it's moving 100 miles an hour, and we're going to get to the bottom of it as best as we can with two of the best reporters in the SEC and two guys that, frankly, in my humble opinion, have been on top of this story like nobody else in the country, and that would be John Talty over on my right here and Matt Zenitz on the bottom of your screen. Guys, first of all, let me just give you a digital pat on the back for the work that you've been doing on this story. It is, I mean, it's been a while since I've been involved in coverage of a coaching search because I'm here in the state of Alabama, but this is one of the wildest that I've ever observed, even, and you guys are really keeping up beat for beat, and you're not throwing trash out there. When John Talty and Matt Zenitz give you a scoop, it's nutritious. It's got good information in it. So congrats to both of you on how you've handled it so far.
Thank you for gassing us up. We need that.
I'm your hype man over here. So let's get into it. Yeah, let's get into it a little bit here. It's been a busy 48 hours in particular, and I think if you're somebody who maybe hasn't been tuned in the last couple of days, a lot has passed you by. Can you start us off by giving us kind of a brief a brief listing of some of the names that have sort of passed through this coaching search and maybe where things stand right now?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a busy 48 hours. I also think, and we can get into this later, but we've also hit into kind of peak spin zone time in which, everyone involved in this search is spinning things different ways. And so there's going to be a lot of different stories coming out of every different experience. But I would say, really dating back to Sunday on, you had Steve Sarkisian expected to interview for the Alabama job, for the Auburn job. That ultimately doesn't happen. You have Billy Napier, quickly kind of emerging as the top candidate on Monday morning. He'd always been kind of a secondary candidate behind Kevin Steele, who people really liked. People thought that he might be the guy. Ultimately, that doesn't happen, and he pulls himself out of consideration. At that point, attention turns to UAB head coach Bill Clark. You get a couple hours worth of people talking about Clark as possibly the next head coach. That ultimately, for most likely, ends Monday night. No kind of conclusion there for Bill Clark being the next head coach. They're moving different directions. So now we're Tuesday morning, and things are kind of spinning up again. You're now seeing Clemson defensive coordinator Brett Venables' name get mentioned. Matt and I reported yesterday that Venables had talked to Auburn on Monday. The feeling was that Venables would likely stay at Clemson. He's been there a long time now under Dabo Swinney. He's making a lot of money, $2.4 million a year. And maybe most importantly, two of his sons currently play in Clemson. And so it seems like maybe in part just because there aren't that many candidates left that the attention has turned to Brent Venables at this point. But again, as we reported yesterday, the feeling after Auburn had talked to him on Monday was that he would likely stay at Clemson.
So I want to turn to kind of the perception that's going on here regarding this search. I think there's a lot, like you said, John, there's a lot of spin involved at this point in the process. I think one of the questions that people have who are looking at this, both from within the Auburn fan base and outside of it, is, we're talking about guys from Sun Belt and Conference USA programs. We're talking about coordinators from Power 5 programs who you would think this would be a vertical move for any of those guys. We're not talking about a situation here where Auburn's swinging big at Power 5 head coaches and missing. These are guys for whom this would very clearly be a move up the ladder, not ending up taking the job. And there's plenty of debate over whose decision that is. But Matt, can you kind of help us clear up maybe why some of these candidates are not working out? What's the feeling right now in terms of why they have not been able to lock in on anybody yet?
Well, there hasn't been a consensus, first of all, behind the scenes on who the ideal candidate would be. So in influential positions who have been very much supportive of Kevin as a top candidate and have wanted him to be the guy, while there have been others like school president and others involved in that, including Alan Green, who have wanted more of a thorough search, and then to go along with that, people involved in that process that just were outright against Kevin in terms of him being hired as the head coach. And I think that's been continued to be the case throughout the course of this process in terms of other guys to go along with that, including Bill Clark. So Bill Clark, obviously well respected in the coaching world based on the work that he's done at UAB. But at the same time, as John and I mentioned in what we put out yesterday, that there were people in influential positions with Auburn, some of those booster figures who at the same time were not as enthusiastic about the prospect of Bill Clark being the next Auburn head coach. So to be clear in terms of some of this, there have been candidates like Billy Napier, who was offered the job and turned it down because based on how it was worded to me by someone who has a feel for Billy's thinking related to that Billy has a certain set of criteria that he's looking for in terms of his next opportunity. And there were elements of this that didn't meet some of that important criteria. At the same time with Bill Clark was not offered the job. He did not turn down Auburn. Things just have progressed in a way where it looks unlikely that Bill Clark is ultimately going to be the next Auburn head coach. And then to circle back on Steve Sarkisian also, the expectation was that they were going to get an interview from him this past Sunday, and they were definitely interested in having discussion with him. He was somebody who throughout the course of this entire process had been mentioned as one of the names most of interest to them to go along with the Kevin Steeles and Billy Napiers of the world. But at the same time, based on what I've heard, there were some influential people from an Alabama perspective that had some conversations on Friday with him and were able to successfully kill that interview.
Interesting stuff on the Alabama side of it. We'll definitely get into that a little bit more later in the show. Before we do, though, I want to back up a little bit and zoom out on this search because, again, as I mentioned, you guys have really been incredibly tapped in on this story. You've been beat for beat with it as it develops. And I want to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit on this and talk to you guys about what you've sort of been seeing as you report this out. And obviously, you're reporters. I'm not going to ask you to reveal how any of your tricks are done here. But John, give me kind of some perspective because you're a guy who's been covering the SEC for a long time. But this is your first time covering a coaching search at Auburn specifically. I'm curious kind of what it's shown you or sort of how it has informed your view of how things work. I think Auburn's always had this reputation nationally as a school where there are highly influential boosters that get involved in important decisions. But what's been your perspective? And I guess has any of it surprised you how this has played out behind the scenes?
Yes and no. I'll tell you this, right after, Gus was fired, I talked to a really good industry source, and that person told me the number one question with Auburn is going to be who is making this hire. And for most schools, that answer is the AD or it's the president. It's usually one or the other. Usually it's the AD makes the hire and he makes the recommendation to the president, and the president, stamps it and it's done. But the fact that was even a question, I think, shows why Auburn is a little unique. People knew that there were going to be some challenges, with this search. Another person I talked to said the biggest issue with Auburn is that there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And what you've seen, I think, play out over these, since they fired him on Sunday, we're on day 9 now. What you've seen are just a lot of people trying to get in the mix to get what they want. And so you've seen, I think, Zenitz kind of hit on this a little bit earlier. You've seen kind of basically people develop into, what I call camps. You've got the pro-Steele camp, and then you've got the anti-Steele camp. And I can tell you on both sides of that are very powerful people. And so typically you hope to try to get everybody aligned. That's the key to, I think, any real major search for a football coach or basketball coach is trying to get everybody aligned as best as possible. That's always challenging. At every school, there's going to be people pulling in different ways. But I think at Auburn, it's more pronounced. And I think what's also interesting about this one is that, again, as we reported yesterday, Kevin Steele is not completely out of this search. I saw there are a bunch of reports that Steele was out. People that I talked to, again, said that he is not out of it, and there's still people pushing for him. So maybe in a normal situation, you make a push for a guy, he gets shut down, and that's it. But with Auburn, you continue to see people push for. Got some breaking news here. Brent Venables, Pete Thamel was reporting crossed Brent Venables off the list. Again, as we first reported yesterday, Brent Venables was expected to stay at Clemson. So just check off another guy from the list if you want. A little breaking news. This live stream podcast, you'll probably already know it by the time you listen to this. But check off another guy. And again, not to toot our own horn here, but I think we were ahead of the curve on that Venables one too, which a lot of people were pushing today.
You were, John. I appreciate you breaking in with that information, though. That's the nature of doing a live show like this. Is sometimes you're going to hear that while we're talking, and sometimes John and Matt's phones are going to blow up in the middle of one of these shows, and they're going to take off without explanation, and we're understanding of that if it needs to happen. So let me move. Just before we move on from the Auburn coaching search aspect of our show today, Matt, you talked a little bit about some of these guys in specifically Steve Sarkisian, but some of these other guys getting, sort of using this search as an opportunity to get raises for themselves. We already saw it with Mario Cristobal. That's part of the game. It's part of what happens here. But usually coaching searches end up resolving in a certain direction on a guy who does see this as a good opportunity. As I'm asking your opinion, your judgment on this a little bit more than your reporting, but as we're starting to see this sort out, and as this coaching search plays out, is it fair to say at this point that that maybe Auburn timed this search poorly, that maybe this wasn't a great year to get into the coaching market just because of how few schools have jumped out there on the market, how things have played out just in the overall atmosphere of college football?
I don't know if I'd necessarily say that. The bigger thing I would say is that it hasn't been handled well in terms of maybe the leadership behind the scenes, and that's been kind of exposed throughout the course of this process. And at this point, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure John's gotten this on his end also, this is very much the talk of the college football coaching world at this point, and not for the right reasons. Auburn is being talked about in a way that they probably would prefer to not be talked about in terms of people within the industry and within this college football coaching world. And one particular text I got last night from an SEC coach probably sums it up best, that after the latest development with Bill Clark, and after it started to become clear that it was unlikely that he was going to end up at Auburn, sent me a text that, and I'll give you the censored version, quote unquote, what the hell? And once again, that's the censored version of what the text actually was.
Looking less and less likely every day, like Auburn is going to blow the roof off with this hire, but you never know till it's over with. It's always exciting when coaching searches happen. Let's
go ahead,
John.
Can you make one point here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So here, this is something that Zenitz has heard me say, but I'll just tell you something that I find interesting now that we're on day 9. I talked to a very good source. I think it was Monday, maybe either Sunday night or Monday morning. And this person said what's going to end up happening if we don't make a hire soon is that we're going to get stretched through this thing. We're going to have certain agents, and I won't say the name because he'll probably hunt me down, but there's an agent in particular that people know that we are going to get played by this guy. We're going to talk to his candidates. They're going to make a big show out of pulling out of consideration, and it's going to look like a total disaster. And then we may end up hiring Kevin Steele at the end anyway, and we're going to look like idiots. And I'm not saying they are idiots, but that guy was pretty dead on so far, because what's happening, again, this is such a perception and narrative battle, because some of this is true, some of it's not. There's all kinds of misinformation out there right now, but Auburn is being made to look very bad. You're already seeing the comparisons to Tennessee, and the longer this drags on, the worse that gets. And again, they have had Wednesday targeted as a while, as the day they want to have the search ended. If it goes past that and goes through Christmas, you're looking at Monday maybe for a hire, and that's when everyone's talking about how this is one of the worst searches ever. So they are in a critical period right now in which they need to have a hire done soon, but this is also upwards of a 10 to 15, maybe $20 million commitment, and you don't want to rush that. So the pressure is really, really cranking up. And like Zenitz said, a lot of people are talking about this search right now, and they're not talking about it in positive ways.
And this is just living proof right here of why so often agents end up, we'll say agents / coaches, win this negotiating war, when this stuff happens. It's because all the schools think you're nothing without us, but when the coaching searches start to happen, boy, that dynamic flips in a hurry. And that's why guys like Gus Malzahn walk away from their jobs with $20 million buyouts, is because they end up having the leverage when the school needs the coach. It's tough. Let's move on to the college football playoffs, which was a contentious issue of its own earlier this week at the bottom of the playoffs, at least for that 4 spot. Really no debate at the top. One of the most boring first 3 slots we've ever seen play out in the college football playoff. Everybody knew that Alabama was going to have that 1 spot. Everybody knew Clemson was going to be there at number 2. And I think right now, heading into these semifinals, there's so much anticipation and belief right now that this is going to be an Alabama-Clemson national championship game, to the point that Matt Zenitz on the Alabama side, we've got almost a 3-touchdown point spread in a college football playoff semifinal game. What's the feeling like so far around Tuscaloosa about this playoff field, and is there sort of a narrative emerging at all that from these Alabama players, from the coaches, about the field that they're about to face?
Well, just from my personal perspective, I just don't see Notre Dame matching up well to Alabama. I think that going into this, that there were obviously a clear top 2 in terms of Alabama and Clemson, and to me, just a clear top 3 in terms of talent as far as these teams, with Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and then a drop-off after that in terms of teams that realistically could be competitive with the combination of these 3 teams. So whether it was Notre Dame, Texas A&M, whoever, I would have had a hard time seeing any of those teams be legitimately competitive against the Alabamas, Clemsons, and maybe even Ohio States of the world. So I would be very, very surprised if Notre Dame beat Alabama. I would be surprised if it was even a competitive game throughout. But I will throw out, in terms of Notre Dame, that they do have the Buckus Award winner. They have an offensive line that's one of 3 finalists for the Joe Moore Award. It's not like they're completely devoid of talent, and obviously have a quarterback, Ian Book, who was mentioned as a Heisman Trophy contender throughout the course of the year also. But at the same time, just got blown out by Clemson. It was a 3-touchdown game, and I think it could be a similar outcome when they match up against Alabama also. And obviously things continue to move in a direction where it seems very realistic that this could be round 4 in terms of national championships with Alabama Clemson in the last 6 years.
Well, before I go to John for his take on this, one thing I do want to ask you about, Matt, is about the loss of Landon Dickerson, which was obviously a big blow and a big emotional moment in that SEC championship game. Your thoughts so far, just as a guy who knows this roster really well, about the impact of that and how they'll replace him?
It's extremely significant. So obviously he isn't as big of a name on a national level as the Devontae Smiths, Mac Jones, Najee Harrises of the world, but he's an all-American caliber player at a critical position, even if he's a guy that casual fans probably don't talk about on a regular basis. He has been the leader of one of the best offensive lines in recent college football history, and that is definitely a concern for Alabama going into the playoffs, losing a guy like that at the center position, where, no offense to Chris Owens, but you're going to have a drop-off there in terms of talent at that spot. And once again, that's a critical position.
Well, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on how that goes. John, I do want to ask you about the playoff picture on a larger scale. I mean, I think we kind of hear this every year from our friends in the media, certainly from fans, this kind of outcry about the number 4 spot. And we hear the same response from the College Football Playoff Committee and the conference commissioners, which is, hey, if we expanded it to 8, you'd all be complaining about who ended up at number 9. Do you sense that that this is particularly a significant year in that discussion, in that debate at all, if only because everybody's so mad and views this Notre Dame selection as so pointless?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think what's going to be interesting is that, I think there's a couple more years left in the current deal. Certainly you're seeing the group of 5 leaders. I think AAC Commissioner Mike Oresco in particular has probably been the most outspoken that this is just basically a rigged system and we never have a shot to make it in. It'll be interesting when they negotiate that next deal, whether there is any changes, whether you would think the group of 5 schools would certainly push to have, more teams included in it. I think we already know, where SC Commissioner Greg Sankey stands, because I think he was the one who even said, if we push it to 8, they'll just complain about who's number 9. I will say, just in general, I think if ever there was a year to have 8 teams, I think this was the year to do it because it was so unprecedented. You had, again, uneven schedule, some teams playing 6 games, some teams playing 11. It would have been fun to have a situation in which you did have 8 teams, so you could have included a Texas A&M. You could have included maybe a Cincinnati or a Coastal Carolina, or one of those other teams, and really get to see more teams play and see who really is the best team beyond just the look test that we saw to determine everything this year. But again, I think it's ultimately going to come down to what the power conferences want, because that's who runs the show. And you've seen people like Sankey and others kind of come out and say, we like the system currently. So I think there's been a lot of media speculation that eventually one day it'll end up as 8. And ultimately, if there's so much money involved that it makes it worthwhile to go to 8, then maybe that will happen. But I think as of right now, some of the key players involved don't want that to happen. And usually they get what they want.
Yeah, it's definitely not a situation where I think like there's a ton of motivation from the guys in charge to change how things work, because they get what they want out of it for the most part. Like you said, I feel like if this is ever going to change, it's going to have to come from multiple power conferences pushing for change. And, look, maybe the Pac-12 says we're sick of getting left out of this all the time. Maybe the Big 12 gets frustrated with it. But for the most part, I mean, look, the ACC and the Big 10 and the SEC are happy with how the playoffs work. And I think as long as that's the case, it's going to be tough for anybody else's opinion to matter too much in how this thing works. But that said, let's just looking at this what we all presume to be the 2 best teams in this playoff. Matt, as you said, it would be the 4th time that we've seen Alabama and Clemson in a national championship game facing off against each other. What's your feeling right now, having seen Alabama obviously a lot of the year, but also having watched Clemson in a couple of games, how these 2 teams would match up? Is there a chance? I guess let me put it this way. I think a lot of Alabama fans will be worried that this is going to be the same story that they saw in San Jose a couple of years ago. Is there reason to believe that the matchup will be different?
I think there are only a couple teams in the country that could present a matchup with Alabama where I would legitimately go into that game questioning whether that team could beat Alabama. There aren't many teams that I would realistically give a chance going in. Clemson would obviously be one of those teams. It wouldn't just be slam dunk and a shock if they were competitive with Alabama. And Clemson, as seems to be the case every year, has continued to get better throughout the course of the season. Obviously, had a great performance against Notre Dame in the ACC championship game. And one of the big things they have working in their favor, they have arguably the best quarterback, arguably the best overall player in college football, in Trevor Lawrence, who's a generational type player at most important position on the field. And it will be a very interesting matchup when that does happen in terms of latest round of Alabama Clemson in a national championship game.
Pretty fascinating that this is, I'm sure a lot of people are sick of it, but it will be an era of college football that I think people look back on and say it was pretty incredible that happened. This sort of repeated heavyweight title fights between these two programs.
And not be over either. Both of them, in terms of Alabama and Clemson, have some very good young quarterbacks who currently in backup positions, but seem like they're in line to be very good players also. So who knows? We might get Alabama Clemson round 5, Alabama Clemson round 6, may get up to Alabama Clemson round 8, 10, 12 by the time it's all said and done.
You're doing the LeBron James. Not one, not two.
Yeah.
Well, we will definitely be keeping you guys apprised of everything that develops as far as Alabama getting ready for the college football playoffs. We will be keeping you posted on the Auburn coaching search. Definitely, if you are not already following John Talty and Matt Zenitz on your social media platform of choice, particularly Twitter, get on it. They're going to keep you up to the second posted on good information about this coaching search. And guys, I guess in the meantime, let me leave us off with just a quick your one more candidate throwing his name in the ring for this Auburn coaching search. Anthony Schwartz, wide receiver at Auburn, says he took Auburn to a 14-0 season on NCAA, so he should get an interview. At this point, I mean, we're talking about somebody. We need to get some offensive energy into this Auburn program. Is Anthony Schwartz a viable candidate at this point?
Who knows? I mean, I will say, I think if you aren't already also following Anthony Schwartz, it's worthwhile.
Yeah, you should.
Because he is reacting in real time to every Auburn coaching program. And it's very amusing just to see him. He was obviously, I think when we put out something about Sark interviewing, he was into that. I don't think he was into Bill Clark based on some of the tweets. You can read through his tweets to see how he feels about every job candidate.
He definitely seems to be favoring offensive coaches, understandably. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, we'll
I would not be surprised at this point. To actually add a serious point to this, I would not be surprised at this point and I think you'll probably start to see it happen in the next couple hours. I would not be surprised if you saw agents reaching out to Allen Green and the search firm trying to get their guys into the mix today. Because again, there aren't many known candidates left for this job. You've seen some names that Zenitz and I have heard over the last 24 hours. Brian Harsin at Boise State, Neil Brown at West Virginia. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some of those names start to pop up as people try to push their guys into the mix. Because I mean, where else are they going to turn?
Your standards start to change if you get turned down or things don't work out enough times. So definitely, this search is not done being interesting and being unpredictable, and we will do our best over at AL.com to keep you guys up to date on it, particularly these two gentlemen who join me here every Tuesday. Also, if you are not already subscribed, you can find us on iTunes and Spotify under First Down South. We post this show there every week as a podcast if you just want to do audio format. So it'll be up there later today once we get the episode updated. So subscribe on those two platforms too. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks John and Matt, and hope you guys have a great holiday season with your family later this week. You too, Matt. My hope for all of our sake is that the next time we do this show, we know who Auburn's head coach is. I think we all would love for this to be resolved by then. Yes.